This is the Counters Challenge. The Counters Challenge is all about advanced CSS, specifically around generated content, generated counters, generated gradients, whether they're radial or linear gradients, and all the fun that goes into using them. So I'm going to break this into two videos because there's two separate parts to this. In the first video, we're just going to focus on the counters themselves. And then in the next video, I'm going to complete the project by adding this background color here, okay? So to get started, we want to first get rid of the markers. Now, if you've ever worked with these markers before, there is a markers property that we can do, right? Dot step, and we go marker, and we can do stuff with this. We can change the color, as an example, to fire brick, like this, and it will change. Not so easy to see, maybe with deep pink, a little bit brighter, right? We can change the font size to maybe 2 rem like this so that it's a little bit bigger, and that's about it, okay? When it comes to this marker property, we don't have any control that allows us to create a background color or borders or anything that we could apply to block level elements. So marker isn't going to do it for us. Instead, what we need to do is we need to get rid of those markers and create our own. So going right to it, to the top of this steps class, we are going to get rid of the style. So it's list style type, and we're just going to set it to none. Now, if you're watching, the numbers were there, but the text didn't move over. And that's because there's some padding in here that we also need to get rid of. There we go. Now we have a couple options for putting the markers back in a way that we can style. The first would be something like JavaScript. We could go in here and const steps equals document, whoops, learn to type, come on, DOCU, there it is, document, query selector, all, and we want to get all of the step items. And then from there we can just go steps with 1 T. I'm having a good old time doing this, for each. We want to get the step, in quotes, step, and the index, okay? And from here we can attach that element. So on the step, we're going to insert adjacent, HTML, all capitals, and this gives us a couple options for whether we want it before the start, after the start, before the end, or after the end. In this case, we want it after begin, not after start, after begin. And it's going to be whatever content we want. We can just type a span in here, close it off really fast, like this. And then inside of here, we add our index, just like this. And we should see that pop in. Arrays are 0 index, so we need to +1 on this, just like that. And now we have our counters. So we could do this. I recommend against doing this. And the reason that I do that is because what happens if JavaScript fails, but CSS is still there? Well, if JavaScript fails and CSS is still there, we get a list with no markers. That doesn't help us visually. So in this case, if we put it on the CSS, then we don't have to worry about that. If CSS fails, then we get the original markers. It'll look a little bit ugly, but they at least do show up. So down in here, we can start to add that. And we do that with a couple things, okay? So in order to make this work, we're going to use something called counter reset. And counter reset allows us to set any sort of a variable name in here. We can name it whatever we want. In this case, I'm going to name it step, and then we give it an initial value. We could also use this in the middle of something and reset a value, hence the name, reset. But in this case, we usually use it to give it that initial value of 0, because we're going to add something to it and then use it. Okay. On top of that, we also have counter increment, just like this. And counter increment is a little bit deceptive in the same way that reset is also the initial value. Increment can be decrement. So I could type 10 in here, which would step by tens, or I could do -1, which would step by -1 each time. It would go in descending order. In this case, because we're only doing +1, I don't need to put anything because the default is +1, which is great. And then we need a way to display this. And the way that we display this is with content. In the same way that we would use content in before to generate random blocks of color or something like that, we can also use content to set the counter. And then we just call our variable name just like this, and it shows up. Now there is a counters, which allows you to do some other cool stuff like doubling up counters for legal style bullets and stuff like that. But today we just need counter. At this point, we can get started. We know what we need to do, so we can add these in. And the place that we add them in is we start by putting this on the nearest parent to what we're trying to do. And so every time we get a new steps, if I was just to copy and paste this block right below it, it would generate a new steps, which would start the counter from scratch. Okay. Down below it, we're going to attach our counter. So we need to go step. We add it to before because we want it to appear before the text. Okay. And then we grab our counter content, copy it, paste it, and we get 0, which is exactly what we expect because we haven't incremented it. So we need to add this in. It used to be that you could add this in right on top of this. For some reason, this no longer works. I'm not quite sure why, but really easy to sort out. Just add it to the container. And so now we have those markers right in there, and we can do pretty much whatever we want. Okay. In fact, we can take this a little bit further before we get started. So instead of using a name that we generate, we get one for free. Because we're using lists, they have to have an internal counter somewhere so that they know which number to display, right? Makes sense? Well, we can do the same by going list item. And list item is internal to the browsers. So if we use this, it will show up. We can paste it in here, just like this, and nothing changes except for the fact that we started at 0, okay? So we should probably start at 1, just like this. There we go. But the cool thing is, again, because it automatically starts it and automatically increments it, we don't actually need this first line or this counter reset. So we don't need to increment it, we don't need to reset it, and it all just works. Okay? So list item, and list item, which saves us a whole lot of code. At this point, we can start to style this. Very quickly, we are going to set it to display block, just like this. Because we want to do stuff to that, we are going to add a width, which is going to be a var of, where is our size? It's right down here. Copy, paste it. Brilliant. Height, same thing, var, paste, right like that. Background color, right? We need that background color. It is also going to be a var of card color. We can just go and grab that, paste it in. This is all working quite well. We need a border radius of 50% to make it a circle. We want the number to sit in the middle, so maybe not block, maybe grid. Pick your favorite method here, but I like this because it's just 2 lines of code. So place items in the center, okay? And that should put it right in the center, just like that. We can add some text formatting. So font size like this is another var of what? It is contents counter size, just like this. Bringing it right up so I get more room. Font weight bold, but not bold. We actually have that down here too, just in case we want to muck around with it later. Font weight bold, doesn't change anything. And of course our color, which is body color. So I can just grab that, paste it in here, and there we go. So at this point we have our counters and they look fantastic, right? We have the circles, we have the numbers inside of them, everything is lining up nice. There are a couple things here that we need to pay attention to before wrapping this video up, okay? Again, part 1 of 2. So before we get started, we have an accessibility issue. And that accessibility issue is right here. You might not realize this, but by removing the bullet, the marker from our list, we've actually made it so that the list won't be read as a list to accessibility technology, okay? Accessible technology. And that's weird, right? I mean, we have it. Why wouldn't it read it? Well, this goes back to years and years ago where we used lists for everything. This is the browser saying we can't have nice things, okay? We abused it, and as such, the browser went ahead and said, if you're going to knock off the markers, then we aren't going to read it as a list. But we can force that really fast just by reintroducing that role, the same one that it already has, so we can just set it to list. And this states our intent that, yes, browser, we actually do want you to read this as a list, okay? The second thing we have is a little bit of funkiness that will hit when we start moving things around, okay? And you'll see that as soon as I add in display block in here. All of a sudden, everything is 0, okay? And that's because by default, the list item has a display of list item, right? We can just type that in there. It's redundant, but we can do it. List item brings back those numbers. Anything else, any other thing in here causes it to break. So as an example, block, inline block, flex, grid, whatever you put in there, it breaks because we're telling the browser that our intent is to not have this be a list item. So again, the browser is doing the work for us. We don't really want that, right? We want something else. So I think this would be better if we just change this really fast to a div, this one to a div, this one to a div, like this. And we should probably wrap these all up. Whoops, too far. Wrap these all up in an li. Use a little bit of Emmet magic to wrap them. So li, 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 li. And now you'll notice that the counter still works, even though it's set to block. In fact, it's blocked by default, right? So we can get rid of this because the div is blocked by default, and the list item, the counters, still work. Even though we're going to push them around, now we don't lose sight of that. We don't have to reintroduce reset or increment. So to wrap up, a couple quick things here. We added counter, right? We started with counter reset and counter increment, and then we displayed it. And there is a lot more power in here with things like counters or other things that you might want to do. Please go and research that because it is awesome. We styled the counter using some of our variables from down here. And then we looked at some of the issues around using this, especially if we're using the built-in counter. It will get blasted away if we just have it on the list item. So we wrapped everything in a div, and we need to make sure that for accessible technology, we want it to be read as a list. So we have a little bit of redundancy in here, but it forces the browser to recognize our intent. And that makes all the difference. In part 2, we'll get started on this box. But until then, take a look at counters, see what you can do, and if you have any questions, ask in the chat. I'll see you in the next one.